So this is the aim or goal of this particular session, in which I will try to describe progressively how we can evolve that vocabulary of the nature of the soul into a vocabulary about the nature of matter. And as you all know, in Vedic philosophy, soul has three aspects, which are called Sat-Chit-Ananda. And we'll try to just understand what these three aspects mean in the case of the soul first, and then we'll try to understand how these aspects appear in the context of matter, and how these three aspects create the experience of the soul, and similarly how these three aspects create what is experienced in terms of matter. So those three aspects which are of the soul, create soul's experience, also have the same corresponding existence in matter as well. Now, before I get started, I want to just give a brief background about, if you want to do some scientific work, we need a vocabulary in terms of how to talk about reality. Reality is just one word, matter is another word, but we need some more sophisticated vocabulary if we want to do science. And every science, including the modern Western science, has invented some vocabulary. So let's get started into understanding of, what do we mean by these, what do I mean by vocabulary? Science has, in the last 400 years, invented a very sophisticated vocabulary, and this vocabulary is constantly increasing. So, for example, in the case of classical mechanics, Newton's mechanics, there are words like particle, gravitation, force, mass, energy, momentum, calculus, equation, and things like that. As this vocabulary started to include other things, we got additional properties such as entropy, the charge of a particle, or things like wave, magnetism, and things like that. And this vocabulary has further expanded in the modern today's science, which includes things like quantum and its properties like spin and color and charm, space, and the properties of space such as curvature. So the scientific vocabulary is constantly increasing, and this is not an exhaustive list of all the words that I use. This is just a sample of the words that I used. If you study any scientific theory, you will always you will find many more words that I use. The point is this, that if you want to do science, you always invent new words. As science progresses, in fact, newer and newer words are added to the language of science. And that means, if you do not have the words, then you cannot conduct science. And so every new theory in science invents a new kind of vocabulary. So, for example, I've listed some 5 important theories here. Classical mechanics has a vocabulary of mass, energy, force, and momentum. Electrodynamics has a different vocabulary of magnetism, charge, or magnetic monopole, electricity, a field, and things like that. Thermodynamics has property, words such as entropy, temperature, pressure, availability, and so on. So every area of modern science invents a new vocabulary, invents a new set of terms, and the theory, is described. Now, when these additional terms are invented, just because one term is not reducible to the other term, you always get some kind of inconsistency between some of these theories. So, for example, entropy doesn't actually reduce to charge in magnetism or electricity. Similarly, curvature, has has a different. It's not quantized, so the quantum vocabulary is different from space-time vocabulary. Similarly, some of the properties like spin in particle physics have no classical equivalent. So as science progresses, new terms are added, the vocabulary expands, And most of the older terms continue to be used, and that expanding vocabulary and diversifying vocabulary presents a very big problem in terms of scientific unification. So how do you understand reality in terms of smaller set of terms? Can we reduce the large number of terms and concepts to a smaller number of terms? And this is just a sample of properties. If you last time we discussed that in particle physics there are over 25 constants, such as the mass of an electron, the charge of an electron, the spin of an electron, and so on. So there are lots of constants, and each of these constant presents a paradox. Why the value is so and so, because it's not derivable from anything more fundamental. Now, if we want to understand Vedic knowledge of matter, we also need a vocabulary. And two things are very important in terms of that vocabulary. Number one, it cannot be at variance with the religious terminology, because if you get a different terminology, then you have the old mind-body problem. For example, if somebody talks about consciousness or the soul, that vocabulary or that term has nothing to do with other properties of matter, such as energy or momentum and particles. And so you have two completely different languages, two completely different vocabularies. And the religious person talks using one vocabulary, one set of words, and the scientific person talks using another vocabulary, a set of terms. So with these two set of vocabularies, the languages are completely different, the descriptions are completely different, and these two things can never converge. There can never be a single understanding of both these things. So a common vocabulary requires a set of terms that cannot be at variance from the religious terminology. But we should also be able to apply the terminology to the study of matter. And the third thing is, we cannot have diversifying or expanding vocabulary, because, for example, if you study the phenomena of heat, then you are using entropy and temperature. But if you're studying motion, then you're doing mechanics and you're using terms like energy and momentum. So entropy is in thermodynamics, momentum is in mechanics, and these two things do not actually converge. So not only do we need to have a common vocabulary between study of matter and the study of the soul, we also should have a stable vocabulary, in the sense that we should not every time I study a new phenomena, I should not need a new vocabulary. If you go into biology, you have a new set of terms. If you go into economics, you have a completely different set of terms. If you study psychology, then you have a new set of terms. So if you aggregate all these scientific fields together, you will have literally thousands and thousands of terms, and they don't reduce. So if this approach has to be better, then not only has there to be a common vocabulary between science and religion, but also a common vocabulary across multiple fields of science. So I should be able to use the same set of terms across economics, sociology, psychology, physics, mathematics, and so on. So that's a very ambitious goal, because if you do not have a common set of terms, or you invent a new terminology that doesn't scale across religion and science or across the different fields of science, then you will ultimately get a lot of towers of Babel, where people are talking different things, and one language doesn't reduce to the other, so you do not get a common understanding. So let's discuss what the basic vocabulary of Vedic philosophy or Vedic religion is, and I use these terms religion and philosophy interchangeably, and we'll see why. And that basic terminology is that the soul has three aspects, which are called Sat-Chit and Anand. And these, if everything is a soul, then these three terms should be applicable to everything. So I should not need hundreds and thousands of terms. I should be able to describe either everything in terms of these three words, or some aspects of these three words. So since just like Sat-Chit and Anand, the three aspects of the soul, similarly there are many aspects of Sat and many aspects of Chit and many aspects of Anand. These aspects are also described in the Vedic text, and we'll try to discuss that in the next lecture. For today, we'll just try to understand these three words, what these three things mean. So Sat essentially means if one person is looking at another person, the choice of looking at that person is what we call consciousness. So if you're looking at an apple or another person, you have a connection or a relationship to that person. Your consciousness is diverted toward that person, and it's diverted away from other things. So that choice is what we generally mean by consciousness, which is the ability to focus your awareness onto one thing. So this aspect is called Sat. Now, once you have the focus on a particular object, then you get an experience, which is euphemism sometimes for saying the content of my consciousness. So there is a consciousness and there is a content, and that content essentially means you get a representation of that person in your mind. So you have, let's say, if you're looking at a person wearing a red shirt, then you get a picture of the red shirt in your consciousness. So that content of your consciousness is called the Chit. And then there is a third thing, which is also called the personality of likes and dislikes. I use the term personality of likes and dislikes, but it's called Anand, and that is how your desire springs. And once you get an experience, you either become happy or you become sad. So or you are delighted or you're unhappy and things like that. So this happiness comes if something is compatible with what you like to see, and unhappiness comes if you don't like to see that. So these are the three basic aspects. You have a you have a choice of your consciousness to attach to something, and then you get an content of the consciousness, and then you get a feeling. So these are the this terminology Sat-Chit-Ananda has other variations which we'll shortly discuss, but these three comprise what we call experience. So if you, let's say, if you remove content from the experience, then you will say, I am looking at something, but I don't know what it is because there is no content. I don't know if it's a red shirt or if it's a person or it's an apple or it's a tree. So if there is no what do you call content, then there is no experience. Similarly, if there is no desire, if there is no like and dislike, then there'll be no direction to the choice in which to look at, and that will entail that there will be no experience. Similarly, if there is no consciousness, you cannot direct the awareness to anything. Still, there will be no experience. So all these three things are necessary conditions for experience to exist. And experience, therefore, is the combination of these three aspects. In the case of self-consciousness, also there is a personality, which is what you like to know yourself as. There is a process of knowing, which is consciousness directing towards itself, and there's a perception of the self. So there is a content, there is a consciousness, and there is a feeling. So when those three things are merged into the same thing, that is called self-experience. But otherwise, you can say there's a worldly experience. It's easier to understand in case of worldly experience, little harder to understand in case of self-consciousness, self-experience. So this the content is also called Chit, and it's sometimes called Chit Shakti in Vedic philosophy, but it's the ability to do cognition and conation. So there are two aspects. One is knowledge and one is activity. We'll discuss that in the next lecture, but briefly, your five senses of seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, hearing, and your five action senses, they are all part of what is called Chit. And then there is a feeling component or a desire component, which has many sub aspects. And similarly, there are many aspects of what do you mean by Sat. So these are the three aspects. This Sat-Chit-Ananda terminology is very common. I think everybody has heard of or would have heard of these things. And it pervades across all Vedic texts. A similar kind of three word terminology is used. Sometimes it's called Sambanda-Abhidhyeya and Prayojana. The words mean the same thing. So for example, if you're looking at a house, then you have what is we call a Sambanda or relationship to the house. If you're looking at food, then you have some relationship to that food. And once you establish a relationship, you get an experience, which is the content. Like there is a house represented in your mind, there is some food in your consciousness, and or if you're tasting something, you get a taste. If you're smelling something, you get a smell, which is different from the external object. So that representation is called abhidheya, which is, in Sanskrit, it's called give and take. This is what you are, when you are doing some activity, you're giving something, and if you're, perceiving, there's a reception. So of the content. And the reason you apply, you have a particular sambandha, and the reason that you have abhidheya is prayojana. So if you want to eat tasty food, then you will establish a connection or a sambandha's relationship to the food. If you want to talk to somebody, then you will have a connection to that person. Right now, you are interested in some Vedic philosophy, so you have a sambandha to your to your laptop, which is in turn having a sambandha to this meeting, and through that meeting, we are having a connection, which is a sambandha. And the abhidheya is the slides that you are seeing, the content, the pictures, the words that you are reading. And the prayojana is that you are interested in acquiring. So these are again the three things: Sambanda, Abhidheya, Prayojana. Again, Sambanda is like, or is the other word used for Sat. Abhidheya is another word used for Chit, and Prayojana is another word used for Anand. Another three terms I use sometimes called, Sandhini-Samvit-Hladini. Sometimes the order is changed. They call Hladini, Sandhini-Samvit. So Hladini, or the pleasure, is the same thing as the Ananda, which is the same thing as Prayojana. And Samvit is the same thing as the content or the experience that you have, and Sandhini is again the relation. So you call it Sandhini, which is something that joins you to the external reality, or you call it Sambandha, or you call it consciousness. These are same things. Consciousness basically means something that establishes connection to something. Right. So these, and there are other terms that I used. I'll not go into so many terms, but the basic point is that even in Vedic philosophy, you will see multiple terms being used. There is Sat-Chit-Ananda, there is Hladini, Sandhini-Samvit, there is Sambanda, Abhidheya, Prayojana. So these three are frequently used. Sometimes there'll be description of Hladini Sakti. Sometimes it will be called pleasure potency. Sometimes it will be called, Prayojana, and sometimes it will be called Anand, and so on. So many words are used, but they all depict the same basic concepts. Now, once we understand this basic picture, we can dive into, how we can use these words, or how we use these words in everyday parlance. So these are three terms which I use in many of my books, and I'll try to explain why I use these particular words. So relation is the choice of consciousness. So for example, we discussed, you can look at food, you can look at a house, you can look at a tree, and your consciousness is moving, and that movement of consciousness, or which is direction of the awareness, is a choice, and that choice is also a relationship. So, or in a more sophisticated term, you can say, I have relationship. So when you're looking at, let's say, your friend, you can say, I have a relationship of friend. I'm looking at that person in the relationship of friend. Similarly, if you're looking at your house, you can say, I'm looking at it in the relationship of being the master of the house. If you're looking at your car, you can say, I'm looking at at it in the relationship of the master of the car. Similarly, cognition, as we explained, so cognition is a shorter term. It includes cognition and conation. Conation basically means activity. So, so this term we can use because what we call the chit is basically cognition and conation. So, Sambit, the term Sambit means becoming one with the known, and this is becoming with means knowledge, and some means exactly the same as the knowledge. So some with means becoming one with the known, and so when you have an experience, essentially you're absorbed in that experience. Abhidheya also means substantive, meaning, something being expressed and things like that. Similarly, emotion is an English word that we use. We can use the term pleasure, but because in this world everything is not always pleasurable, so if we use the term pleasure, that is not very descriptive, because there is also pain in this world. So emotion is a better word, because we have both pleasure and pain. We have happiness and distress. We have many words are there. There's a elaborate system of about 16 different kinds of emotions. If you study the system of drama or the system of arts in Indian philosophy, then you'll see they have a system of 15, and sometimes they 16 different kinds of emotions. Similarly, if you study cognition, there's a elaborate system of initially 12, then there are 72, and then there is 84. So there are broad divisions. If somebody is interested, you can pick the book called Cosmic Theogony, which there are all these divisions of Sat-Chit-Ananda discussed. Another term that we can use, and this is again something I use in some of my books, is opportunity, ability, and desire. So I can give you the example, let's say my body, or most of our bodies have the ability to walk. So what do we mean by body is essentially this ability to walk, to talk, to eat, to sleep, or to do other things and things like that. So body essentially means these kinds of abilities. But to exercise that ability, there must be an opportunity, right? So let's say my body might have the ability for swimming, but I must also have a swimming pool before I can exhibit that ability, right? So that relationship to the swimming pool where I am able to swim is the opportunity by which this ability is exercised. And even if there is a swimming pool, I might still not swim because I might not have the desire. So there must be an ability to swim, there must be an opportunity to swim, and there must be a desire to swim. And when all these things are there, and all these things combine, then the ability for swimming combines with the opportunity, which is the swimming pool, which combines with the desire to swim, and that's how you get the experience of swimming. So that experience of swimming has three components: a desire component, an ability component, and an opportunity component. Now, these terms are very important to understand in the context of material experience, because in this material world there are limitations, right? So my body is limited; I cannot see beyond certain distance. Similarly, my desires are limited. I cannot like and everything in the world, and same with everybody. You cannot like everything. You like certain things. So there's a limitation of desire, there's a limitation of ability, and there is a limitation of opportunity also. We cannot get access to everything. Everybody doesn't have access to a good car or a good house or good education or so many things. So when we use this term opportunity, ability, and desire, again, we are using the terms in the context of a material world where we can describe these things in a limited sense. Now, these limitations are what is said to be the covering of the soul. So that covering of the soul is essentially a limitation of the soul. And that limitation appears in the three ways in which the soul is, so to speak, free. So the freedom could be that I could desire anything, but the material condition would be that I'll not be able to desire everything. I'll not be able to like everything. The freedom would be I should be capable of everything. I should have all kinds of abilities. But the material condition is that your chit or your ability to perceive or your ability to do things will be limited. Similarly, the freedom would be that I should have opportunity for everything. Whatever I desire, I should have the opportunity. But the opportunity is also limited. So all these three things are limited. And once we, so these three terms help us understand What matter is in terms of the limitation it exerts on soul. Another evocative example is the words character, actor, and personality. So you can think of a drama or a movie where let's say you're seeing somebody play the role of a king. So the king is the character. Then the person who's playing that character of the king is the actor, and that actor has a personality, which is that personality of the actor is hidden while playing the character, but it is also partially visible in the sense that each actor brings some of their personality into the character. So there are some actors, I don't have to name them, but you can say that that actor is always, showing the same personality. That doesn't matter which character they're playing. Okay, and so the personality of the actor shows in the character, but good actors will be able to hide their personality and just play the actor. So there are several techniques of acting which you can say there are method actors and there are character actors and there are personality actors and things like that. So again, actor is basically playing a role, and the character is the role, and there's the personality of the actor. And so while the actor is playing that character, he might have certain inner feelings which are not visible to the other people. I have not listed this example in this slide, but another evocative example is the use of first person, second person, and third person things. So actor is the third person description. So let's say actor is basically, what I mean by that is the body. So you can see the body, and that body is everybody will see the same body. But a character is something that comes to play in a particular relationship. So you are in a certain character with your mother, you are in a different character with your father, you are in a different character with your friends, you are in a different character with your wife and kids and so on. So you are playing many characters, the actor is the same. So the character is unique to a relationship, the actor is visible in all the relationship. And the personality, or what you like and dislike, your feelings and emotions, are in the first person sense. Nobody can actually, of course, there is some, personality, seeps through the actor and into the character, but the experience of that emotion is only unique to you. Like if you're in pain, nobody can feel your pain. If you're in happiness, nobody can feel your happiness. It's only, they can know that you are probably feeling sad or probably feeling happy, but they cannot feel what you're feeling. So in that sense, the ananda or the happiness is first person. The character is second person in the sense that it's between two people, and the actor is third person. So you can also use that term first person, second person, third person to understand these three things. Now, we can talk a little bit about how these terms also appear in philosophy. And mostly when I talk about philosophy, I'm talking about Western philosophy here. So there are three terms: the universal, individual, and contextual. So last time somebody talked about Platonic world. That Platonic world is comprises of what is called universal. So universal essentially means an idea. So seeing is a universal, tasting, touching, smelling, color, smell, shape. These are different kinds of universal. Similarly, thinking is a universal, or table is a universal. Universe, well, if there are many universes, then you can say universe is a universal. But every concept that you use in terms of your cognition or connection is a universal. So walking is a universal, talking is a universal, the presentation is a universal. So these are all concepts, but these cognitive concepts or the action concepts are not the only concepts. There is also something called an individual, right? So once you have, let's say, for example, there's a car is a universal, but there are many instances of cars, right? So there are several individual cars. In the case of material objects, we would say that these individuals are simply particles. This is what physics does. All the particles are effectively identical. But if you take the Vedic concept of individuality, what it means is every individual person, even if they look exactly identical, they have a unique persona. right? So even if their body was identical, they had the same features, still internally they would be unique. And that individuality is also conceptual, but it's a different kind of conceptuality, which is to say that each individual is different in terms of likes and dislikes. You can distinguish two people by saying that, oh, this person is shorter and other person is taller, this person is there has a gender and things like that. But then there is a deeper sense in which you can say this person is cruel, or this person harsh, or this person is kind, this person is soft, and they are kind-hearted, and or they are gregarious, and sometimes you can say they're depressed, and so on. So there is this unique personality which is so to speak, behind the body is the sense of individuality. There are many concepts about that, which are different from the concepts of seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, table, chair, tree, and so on. Then there is something called contextuality, which is also, we talked about, there are relationships. So it's a father and son relationship. That's a concept. And then, or you can say citizen in a country, that there's a relationship, or you can say employer and employee, that's a relationship. So again, the same three terms, there's a relation, there is a cognition, there is an emotion, or you can say there is Anand, there is Chit and Sat, there is Hladini, Sandhini-Samvit, there is Sambanda-Abhidhyeya-Prayojana. So same three words, but they appear in philosophy in a different incarnation, where you use the terms universal, individual, and contextual. These three words are also very important in terms of what we call judgments. And in the context of judgments, you have three kinds of judgments: truth, right, and good. The cognitive judgment is the judgment of truth. So if you see that, if you say sky is purple, you can say, oh, this is the wrong, this is the false judgment, right? We use, in English, we tend to use wrong and false interchangeably, but if you were properly a philosopher, saying that the sky is purple is wrong, but the statement sky is purple is false, right? So the action is right or wrong, the statements are true or false, and if you enjoy the statement, then it is good. If you don't enjoy it, it is not good. So Sat-Chit-Ananda also appear in terms of three words or three judgments, which are called truth, right, and good. So if you can digest this vocabulary, then you will see a lot of things subsequently become very easy. For example, the antakaran of the jiva is described as three instruments, which is buddhi, ahankara, and mahat. And buddhi judges the truth, ahankara judges whether it's good, and mahatattva judges whether it is right. So once you grasp these three things, you can immediately see why they are reflections of the soul. And the mind reflects the meanings which can be true or right or good. So it has the representation of meaning, which is different from the representation of judgments. And so therefore, sometimes it says the mind has the property of thinking, feeling, and willing. So the thinking is the truth, the feeling is the good, and the willing is the right. So these three aspects, again, they are reflected in the intellect or in the antakaran. They are also reflected in the mind. And these words, right, truth, and good, they appear also in philosophy. Greek philosophers had three terms which they used to call ethos, logos, and pathos. So logos is the truth, ethos is the right, and pathos is the good. So you'll often see people talking about, the term logic, for instance, comes from the idea of logos, that there is something called the truth, and that which is compatible with this truth is, and logic helps us understand whether it's compatible with the truth, and therefore it's truth. And the original thing that is the truth is logos. Similarly, ethos is the righteousness and the activity that you perform through relationship. So, for example, if you're seeing, you should not you should not look at certain people, or you should not look at them in a certain way, or you should not say certain things. So, or you should not have a relationship with someone. Certain relationships are forbidden. And so that is what is called ethos, and pathos is the goodness of the feeling. Now today, pathology has come from pathos, but it has a negative connotation. But pathos originally means the feeling or the emotion that you have. And when aesthetics is done, then mostly they talk about, at least Greeks used to talk about pathos. They did not talk so much about logos, but time came in philosophy on where art was supposed to be a depiction, not just of the goodness of the feeling, but also of the logos. So you're depicting the truth and you're depicting it beautifully. And that depiction of the truth in a beautiful manner is right action. Right? So these three things, these are three different connotations of how art becomes the truth, the right, and the good, but they combine three different ideas. We can also look at some everyday equivalents. This is how, let's say, a small girl is, in this picture, small girl is standing on a chair and trying to reach to something in the refrigerator. So you can ask, what is the girl standing on? Is that a chair or is it a ladder? And the answer, this becomes very confusing because you can say, yeah, she's standing on a chair, but at this time the chair is, working like, or it's playing the role of a ladder. So again, you could have used a ladder proper, and then in that case you would say, yeah, she is standing on a ladder, and but the purpose of the ladder would be very clear to you, in the sense the ladder is designed or is meant for reaching, but the chair is not meant for doing that, even though it can sometimes be used. So in this case, the goal or the prayojana is that you want to reach something. And then you have used the chair, which is the abhidheya, and then you're using it in a certain relationship or role, which is making it a ladder. So this confusion of whether it is a chair or a ladder is resolved by saying that the object is a chair, but right now it's playing the role of a ladder. So for example, you might have a big diamond and you might use it as a paperweight. And so you can say, what is it? Is it a diamond or a paperweight? And the answer would be, yeah, it's it's a diamond, but it's playing the role of a paperweight. Similarly, you can say, who is this person? And sometimes you can say, he's my father, or sometimes you can say, he's so and so by name. So when you use the name, then you're describing the person, but when you're saying he's my father, he's describing a role. So these three words also appear in ordinary language in terms of what we call role, object, and purpose. A similar type of illustration you can show here. A man is holding a knife, which is a kitchen knife. So you can say, is it a kitchen knife or is it a weapon? And the answer is that the object is the knife. The role that it's playing right now, the relationship that it has to the hand is that of weapon. And the original purpose of the knife was to cut vegetables, but the purpose right now is to hurt somebody else. Right. So again, you get role versus object versus purpose, and the knife in this context is called a weapon, whereas in other contexts, if the knife was held upright or knife was straight and things like that, then you would call it a knife. In this case, you would call it a weapon. So it's a knife, it's a weapon. And what is actually is by understood by distinguishing between the object and the role that it's playing. So we can now take some of these examples and even see some scientific equivalents of these ideas. So the role, let's say you have, if you see this describes the pictures of an aircraft, so you can easily understand there are objects like this is the engine. So most of the aircraft, for instance, are designed with substitutable engines. So you can get one company's engine or you can put another company's engine. So the engines are substitutable. The plane design is intact in the sense that you can replace you can say this is the engine here. And when you say this is the engine here, all you're talking about, it has a role. There is a place in the design play the role of an engine, but physically the engine or the individual object can be something different. So you get a structure which is comprised of, you can say it's a functional structure in the sense that each part plays a different role. There's a fuselage, there is an engine, there is a rudder and things like that. And similarly there are seats and pilot cabin and things like that, and their wheels. So there are, so when the design is done, then you get different roles, which is called collectively the structure. Then each of these roles is populated by certain objects, and then ultimately you can have a purpose, which you can say it's a passenger aircraft, or a commercial or transport aircraft. So you can design. So sometimes the generally, in fact, the purpose plays the most important role. So based on the purpose, you will produce a structure, and based on the structure, then you will produce an object. So for example, if you wanted to carry 10 tons of material in it, then you might have certain kind of engine. But if you wanted to carry 100 tons, then you'll need a completely different kind of engine. So again, the purpose, similarly, you would have seats if you wanted to build a commercial, if you wanted to create a passenger aircraft. But if you wanted a commercial aircraft, then you would have a different kind of design. So again, purpose influences the structure, structure influences the objects. And similarly, if you had no choice but to pick a certain object, then that object will force a certain kind of design that will in turn force a certain kind of purpose. So this is a very interesting dynamic, which is that each of the three modes can actually change change the effect of the other mode. So for example, objects can influence structure, structure can influence purpose. Similarly, purpose can influence the structure, structure can influence objects. So each of these, we talked about earlier how each of these three things must combine, and they're necessary. But in terms of causality, you'll also have the situation where each of these three things can be the cause, and the other two can be the effect. So we'll discuss some of that maybe in the next lecture. But this is another way to understand that same terminology. So we have talked about how conscious experience is the combination of these three components. There is always something that you are experiencing. You can call that an object, and you have a relation to it. And you have some cognition and recognition, and there is always a feeling associated with that. So our experience of these three components actually has a material counterpart, in the sense that you can talk about an object, a structure, and a purpose for that. Similarly, you can or you can say that there is an object, has a role, and it has a goal for that. So now we can turn to what do we mean by science. And science, essentially, current science is defined as the study of matter. And there has been extensive discussion and debate about is this the right definition of science. But people continue to use science as the study of matter. But we can redefine in Vedic philosophy, or even astute philosophers of in Western philosophy, they define science as the rational explanation of conscious experience. So anything that you can experience. So for example, if you have mental experience, the study of that can be called psychology. If you have a pain in your stomach, the rational study of that can be called biology. If you're having an experience of moving particles or moving waves and things like that, you can call that kind of experience which has a rational explanation. It's called physics. So the reason the vocabulary of science diversifies is because you are studying different domains, and each domain of experience is designated as a different science. So psychology is a different science, and philosophy is a different science, and physics and mathematics and biology, all these things are different kinds of sciences, because you're changing the experience. But if we say that all experience is actually comprised of only three components, then the definition of science is that you're always trying to explain experience in the same way, because all experience is constructed out of three components. So it doesn't matter, you should be able to study psychology with these three components, physics with three components, mathematics with three components, biology with three components, sociology with the three components, economics, using the same three components. And they are always the same three components. There's a relation, there's an emotion, there is a cognition. So what you achieve by this using this terminology is one, you can have the same words being used for religious experience and for material experience. Similarly, you can have the same words used for different kinds of material experience, whether it's experience of the mind or the experience of physics or experience of economics or markets, whatever it is, it's all experience, and you're always going to construct that experience out of three components. Right? So this is what we achieve by reducing all these. We saw at the beginning we had literally dozens of terms, and these terms are just a small sample. If you go into any subject, you will see hundreds of terms, and every subject student just tries to learn these terms, definitions, and how to use these words and so on. But if we learn these three terms, what they actually mean, how they appear in different contexts, then you just have to understand three words. And with that, spiritual experience, material experience, all the subjects that are to be known. So all that there is to be known is simply these three words and their combinations, how they combine, which is, or the various ways in which they combine. So all science essentially reduces to the study of experience. Experience reduces to the combination of three components. So this is, you can say, the journey from religion to science. It's a journey about developing a certain kind of vocabulary. That vocabulary is the vocabulary of the soul, which is, slowly becomes the vocabulary of my ordinary language. And it becomes a vocabulary of philosophical language, becomes a vocabulary of ordinary experience, and finally it becomes a vocabulary of scientific language. So this slide basically tries to capture this journey that we had, where we started with Sat-Chit-Ananda, Hladini, Sandhini-Samvit, and we talked about relation, cognition, emotion, and other things that we use in ordinary language. Then we talked about philosophical language, contextual, universal, individual, truth, right, good. And we talked about scientific language, where you can talk about things and structures and goals. So these are the things, and each term has an equivalent version in ordinary language, in philosophical language, and in scientific language. And there's an equivalent term in religious language. So the understanding of this religious language can demystify the understanding of ordinary experience, understanding of philosophy, and understanding of science. So this is the terminology that once we invent this terminology, or once we understand this terminology, which is based on the terminology of the soul, then I can do science without being contrary or contradiction to a religious language. Similarly, I can do science without a contradiction to philosophy. I can do different fields of science without a contradiction to each other. And I can do a science without having to separately explain what that means in ordinary language. Right? So these are different kinds of things that, like, for example, if you see, astute scientists will write some popular science books, or they'll come on TV channels and they'll try to explain what science means. And essentially what they're doing is translating the scientific language into ordinary language. Similarly, people who are trying to explain religious experience, they try to translate into a philosophical language, right? So a lot of Vedic texts and a lot of philosophy is done simply to explain the nature of religious language. Or theology, or what is called apologetics, is essentially trying to convert religious experience into a philosophical language. Similarly, scientific language is also often translated into a philosophical language. So you can have subjects like philosophy of science, or philosophy of physics, or philosophy of space, and things like that. So there are different disparate languages being used today, and there is a lot of interconversion and translation that happens. And in each interconversion and translation, a lot of information is lost. And most of the time, a lot of things cannot even be interconverted. So you cannot, for example, today convert the language of physics into the language of economics. So if a physicist wants to talk to an economist, either one has to learn the other person's language, or they come back to ordinary language or some philosophical intermediate language where they can converse. And the same problem exists for religion and science today. There is a completely different language here, and this is a different language. But if we adopt this language, then we can, get to a common language. Now, we talked about these three categories, but modern science studies only two categories out of these three. And that one category is what is called objects and their properties. So properties are just aspects of objects. So science only studies objects, but we have talked about there is an additional thing in addition to the object is that role that it plays. Like a chair, you can say it's an object, but it can play the role of a ladder. Similarly, the purpose for which that object was designed or intended is not in the scope of scientific study. And this becomes important in the sense that we are not able to talk about matter having any purpose. And so these, out of the three things of object, structure, and purpose, science only studies objects. It doesn't regard roles, structures as fundamental reality. In fact, if you study chemistry, for instance, molecular structure is nothing but properties of the electrons, right? So it's not considered a fundamental reality in itself. It's a reducible reality, reality reduced to the properties of the objects. And purpose, of course, has absolutely no existence. So out of the three categories, science only studies one. So there are two additional categories which create number of scientific phenomena or material phenomena which are not amenable, because everything has to be reduced to objects, but that reduction is not possible in most cases. So you get incompleteness in science. Similarly, even though science studies objects and the properties, they're just physical properties in the sense of energy, mass, momentum, particle, wave, and things like that. Tables and chairs or taste, touch, smell, sound, these are not legitimate properties or objects. So even though we are studying objects and their properties, but we are not able to describe how we experience them, right? So all experience has to be reduced to measurement instruments, right? So you let's say temperature, you need to have a thermometer. Speed, you need to have a speedometer, or direction, you need to have a gyroscope. So you need to have different kinds of measurement instruments, and you are not able to translate the thing detected by a measuring instrument into how you experience it. And there are several aspects of experience. Let's say, for example, taste and smell today have absolutely no explanation in physics or chemistry. Molecular structure, we are not able to explain how sulfur dioxide, for example, has a particular smell, or nitrous oxide is a certain smell. There are 2 atoms or 3 atoms, and how do you explain that? We cannot reduce the smell to either the atoms, and we are not able to reduce it to the structure, because the structure in turn gets reduced to the atomic property. So the sensations or the experience are not explainable or reducible to this. So not only is science studying only 2 out of the 3 categories, even that one category that it's studying is severely depleted, because it's not able to experience even the cognition of the world. Forget about additional properties. But if you take these 3 kinds of things, then you get additional aspects where you can talk about hierarchies. So in material science and modern science today, we can never talk about hierarchy. We can, so here, for instance, a hierarchy of objects, you can say you have a body which has a leg and a hand. The hand has palm and finger. This is very intuitive in ordinary language, but in science, you can never talk about that. So there is nothing called a hand. There is nothing called a leg. There's nothing called a body. It's just language in ordinary language, but in scientific language, there are just atoms and molecules. So there's nothing called a palm or a finger. You further reduce that ultimately to atoms and molecules. Similarly, there is a language of roles. There is in an organization, you have a CEO, then you have head of finance, head of sales. You can have Asia sales, Europe sales, and things like that. So you construct a hierarchy of roles, but you cannot do that in modern science. Similarly, you have hierarchy of goals. High level goal everybody has is to be happy. but you can have a goal of having a career or having a family as part of aspects of being happy. In the career goal, you can have earning money or exciting work as aspects of having a career. So there is a sophisticated language of hierarchies in which there are aspects of the aspects of the aspects. But that language is not translatable into modern science because every higher level is eliminated and reduced to the lower level. But the fact is that that reduction always misses something because these higher levels are not actually reducible to the lower levels. So that hierarchy brings in additional properties. And these there are three kinds of hierarchies as we are seeing here. There's objects, roles, and goals. So once we accept these three kinds of, so to speak, ontologies, ontology is a philosophical term. If we accept that, then we have we also get a hierarchy. Stop here and summarize. We talked about in the last time that everything is a soul, matter is also a soul. In this session, we just talked about how soul has three aspects, which have various names in the Vedic text. And these three names, these three words also have counterparts in everyday language, in philosophical language, and in scientific language. So if we can understand these three terms, what they mean, how they create experience, then we can also create a new vocabulary for science. And the advantage of that vocabulary is that it's not only consistent across religion and science, it's also consistent across many different fields of science. So you get a common vocabulary, a common language, using which you can go from one subject to the other subject, and that creates essentially the solve the conundrum of diversifying knowledge. How can I know many subjects by studying one subject? Today we cannot do that, but if we follow the system, then we can do that. So I'll pause here and